I held her hand the night she died. 32 years old, 3 babies just ripped from her silent body, and down the hall, her husband was texting his girlfriend. I saw it. I said nothing. For months, I watched that woman move into her house, wear her life like a costume, post pictures of her dead baby shoes with the caption, "Second chance." I smiled. I stayed silent. I was a coward. But here's what no one knew: Colleen wasn't a victim. She had already won. Before she ever walked into that delivery room, she had built a fortress around her children that no cheating husband, no stolen inheritance, no forged signature could ever tear down. And hidden inside that nursery closet, behind a stack of soft baby blankets, was the key to destroying him completely. What a dying mother leaves behind can be more powerful than anything the living ever say. If this story moves you, if you believe silence has a cost and courage has a name, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because every week, we tell the stories of women who fought battles the world never saw coming.
We're losing her. Get the crash cart. Now! Dr. Prescott's command sliced through the chaos, her voice steady, but I saw her hands tremble. In her whole career, she'd never lost a mother, and I could feel her refusing to let tonight be the first. The alarms were shrieking, a relentless, high-pitched wail that sticks with you forever. We were all a blur of motion. I was one of the nurses pressing gauze, trying to stop the bleeding, while others managed the IV and yelled vitals. Colleen Ashford was only 32, 8 months along with triplets. Her hair was matted with sweat, her lips a pale, terrifying blue. In her hand, she was clutching a crumpled ultrasound photo from her 20-week scan. I could just make out the 3 little hearts she'd drawn on it in purple ink. They were her whole world. Her eyes flickered open for just a moment. She looked right at Dr. Prescott, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "Tell them," she breathed, "every single day. I wanted them." Then her eyes fell shut for the last time. As the cart burst in, Dr. Prescott fought for her. She did compressions, used the defibrillator, pushed epinephrine straight into the line. For 11 minutes that felt like a lifetime. She worked while the surgical team performed an emergency C-section. 2 girls, Margot and Bridget, and a boy, Theodore, came into the world crying, their lungs filling with their first raw, beautiful breaths of air. Their mother's lungs were still. She was gone. Dr. Prescott finally stepped away, pulling off her gloves and staring at the wall clock. 9:47 p.m. It's a time I'll never forget. Time of death, she said, her voice breaking on the last word. 9:47 p.m. The room fell into a heavy quiet. Not a true silence, of course. The machines still beeped, and those tiny babies still cried. But all of us, the people in the room, we went still with the weight of what had just happened. Down the hall, Grant Ashford leaned against a wall, his face lit by the glow of his phone. He wasn't praying. He wasn't even pacing. He was just texting, his thumbs moving with an unnerving efficiency. I was the one who had to go get him. My face was still wet with tears. I said his name. He didn't look up. I said it again. He just held up a single finger, that universal sign for 1 minute. The third time, my voice was sharper. "Mr. Ashford, you need to come with me now." He finally looked up, his face blank, and slid the phone into his pocket. He just walked, no urgency, no questions. He followed me back to the room as if he were being led to a meeting. Theodore, Margot, and Bridget had already been taken to the NICU, 3 tiny bundles in their little isolettes. They were small, but they were fighters, just like she had been. Grant stood there, looking down at them, then at me. "They're all healthy?" he asked, and the clinical nature of the question sent a chill down my spine. I just nodded. "Good," he said. That's good. He never once asked about Colleen, not until Dr. Prescott approached him, not until she had to say the words out loud. Even then, his reaction was so measured. He just closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, letting out a slow breath like a man dealing with a minor financial loss. The hemorrhage? He asked. Dr. Prescott explained we did everything we could, that the abruption was too severe. I am so sorry, she told him. He just nodded. But the babies are okay, he stated, not even a question. The babies are stable. Okay, he breathed out again. I have to make a few calls. He then turned and walked right back out into the hallway. DS6. He took out his phone and made a call instantly. It wasn't the fumbling search of a man lost in grief. He knew exactly who he was calling. It's me, he said. She's gone. I overheard him as I passed by. Come to the hospital, but wait for the morning. I'll text you. After he hung up, he just stood there for a moment under the humming fluorescent lights. The sterile smell of the hospital seemed to hang heavier in the air around him. He tucked his phone away, straightened his shirt collar, and then walked back toward the NICU. By the time he re-entered, his face was a perfect mask of a grieving husband. Just after 11:23 that night, Dorothy Brennan arrived. She'd driven 4 hours straight through a storm from Ridgewood after hearing her daughter's water broke 6 weeks early. She'd just thrown a few things in a bag and drove, praying the whole way. She walked onto our floor, expecting the joy of meeting her grandchildren for the first time. It started with a phone call, but the one that haunts me came 8 weeks before Colleen died. The memory plays on a loop. I remember laughing, telling her she was just nervous about the triplets. I dismissed her fear. Then came the second call, the one that told me she was gone. I drove to the hospital in a daze, the rain on the windshield blurring the world into streaks of gray. I kept thinking about that last conversation, her voice tight with a fear I didn't take seriously. I walked into that sterile, quiet ward, expecting to be an auntie, to hold those tiny babies, and tell Colleen she was a worrier for nothing. I was so wrong. She was 61, with silver hair and hands that looked like they had worked hard her entire life. She'd raised 2 kids on her own after her husband passed, worked 2 jobs for 15 years. She was a survivor, ready to finally be a grandmother, but a hospital chaplain was waiting for her at the nurse's station, and when Dorothy saw him, she just stopped. She looked from the chaplain's face to mine, and I saw the recognition in her eyes. She knew. A mother always does. No, she whispered, just that one single word. The chaplain stepped toward her, speaking in that soft, practiced voice they use for delivering the worst news imaginable. But she wasn't listening. I could see she was hearing nothing but the blood rushing in her ears and the buzzing of the hospital lights. Somewhere down the hall, one of her grandbabies cried, and the sound seemed to break her. She just sank to the floor, right there in the middle of the hallway, and let out a sound that wasn't even a word. It wasn't a scream either. It was something deeper, a sound of pure, primal loss that rips right through you. I knelt beside her as nurse brought some water. Grant eventually appeared and came over, putting a hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Dot, he said, his voice so calm it was chilling. She fought so hard. The babies are fine. She would want us to focus on them. Dorothy looked up at him, and through her tears, I saw something else flicker in her eyes, rage, and a deep, gut-wrenching suspicion. It was a warning I should have heeded. She let us help her up and asked to see her grandchildren. The NICU was so warm and quiet, filled with the soft, rhythmic beeps of the monitors. She went to Margot's isolette first. The baby was so tiny, just 5 pounds and 2 ounces, with a little wisp of dark hair and Colleen's exact same nose. Dorothy's hands were trembling too much, so I helped guide her hand into the isolette. She just touched Margot's tiny hand with one finger, and the baby's fingers instantly wrapped around it. It was just a reflex, I know, but in that moment, it felt like a message from Colleen, a promise that she was still there. She stayed for a long time, touching each of her grandbabies, memorizing every detail of their faces. She didn't rest. I saw her later, sitting in a waiting room chair, just staring. For months, the image of Grant's coldness and Dorothy's devastation played over and over in my mind. Then one day, I saw a post online. It was his new girlfriend, with Colleen's babies, holding up those little shoes. That was it. My silence had become a weight I couldn't carry anymore. I found Dorothy's number, my heart pounding, and I wrote the text that would change everything. My name is Sarah. I was your daughter's nurse. There are things you need to know. I saw him from across the crowded church. He wasn't grieving alone. A woman with dark hair and lipstick the color of blood was right there with him. I saw her hand in his. I saw her lean her head on his shoulder. And he just let her. My stomach twisted. I felt this cold dread wash over me, a physical thing that made my hands clench. I watched them, this perfect little tableau of sorrow that felt so staged, so wrong. I saw her walk away, and I saw Grant smooth his tie before heading back inside to play the widower. That night, I couldn't close my eyes. I didn't sleep. The image of them was burned into my mind. I started to understand that I hadn't just lost my friend. She had been taken. The light streamed through the stained glass, painting the floor in colors that felt like a mockery. How could the world be beautiful when Colleen was gone? Grant got up to the podium, looking every bit the heartbroken husband in his expensive suit. He unfolded a piece of paper, his hands trembling just so. Colleen was the light of my life, he started, his voice cracking perfectly on cue. The whole church sighed with pity. I felt sick. He called her generous and loving, a selfless mother. Every word was a lie I could feel in my bones. She gave everything, he said, fought for her children. He called her a fighter, his best friend. He even managed to squeeze out a few tears. I don't know how to do this without her, he whispered. And I just knew, he'd been practicing that line. When he finished his performance, people clapped. They actually clapped. For his grief, I stayed glued to my seat, watching her mother, Dorothy. She didn't stand, didn't clap. She just sat there, a statue of dignity and quiet rage. Her strength was terrifying and beautiful. I saw Colleen's brother, Fletch, sitting next to her. He's a big guy, but he looked like he'd been chiseled out of stone. He never took his eyes off Grant, his jaw muscles clenching over and over. I heard Dorothy whisper something to him, something I couldn't hear but could feel. A cold certainty settled in my heart. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. Later, I saw the woman from the church signing the guest book. Vivian Holloway, it read. Close family friend. I'd known Colleen my whole life. I'd never heard that name. She wore a black dress that fit her like a glove and that same bold red lipstick. It wasn't a lipstick for mourning. It was a lipstick for a declaration. She watched Grant's eulogy, not with sadness, but with a look of unnerving satisfaction, like an investor watching her stock price climb. The reception afterwards was a blur of casseroles and quiet whispers. People brought food because it's easier than bringing real comfort. Everyone told Dorothy the same empty things. She's in a better place. Time will heal. But I knew better. Time doesn't heal this kind of wound. I had known Colleen since we were 12. Her freckles, her laugh. It also felt like a phantom limb. I watched Dorothy, standing by the window, so composed, and I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The guilt was eating me alive. I walked over, my heart pounding. "Dot," I said, my voice shaking. "I have to tell you something." I told her about the phone call, about how Colleen had sounded so scared. "She said if anything happened," I whispered, the words feeling heavy and real for the first time, "I should check the nursery closet, behind the baby blankets." I saw a flicker of something in Dorothy's eyes. The noise of the room, the grief, it all just fell away. There was only her face, listening. She didn't gasp or cry. She just held my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," was all she said, but I knew in that moment I had done the right thing. I had passed her the key I'd been too scared to use. In the days that followed, I watched from a distance. I saw how Grant's mother, Laurel, with her perfect hair and pearls, circled Dorothy like a predator. Laurel never offered a kind word, just a cold, calculating stare. I heard he'd hired a new nanny almost immediately, some friend of Vivian's. He'd cleaned out Colleen's closets, canceled her accounts, moved on with a speed that was nothing short of monstrous. I kept a little notebook, just like I saw Dorothy doing. I wrote it all down, praying it would mean something. I remember Dorothy telling me Colleen had bought her that brown leather purse, the one with the little DB on it. It felt like Colleen was still there, helping. About a week after the funeral, I couldn't stand it anymore. I called Dorothy, just to check in. Her voice was different. It was quiet, but it had a steel edge to it I'd never heard before. She didn't tell me what she was doing. She didn't have to. I knew that my words, the ones I had almost swallowed, had landed on solid ground. She was fighting back. That small spark of a warning Colleen had given me had finally found the right person to start a fire. It was all I could do, but I started to feel a sliver of hope. I remember the first time the silence felt wrong. It was a Tuesday, I think. Colleen was in her garden, her belly so round with the babies she could barely bend. Grant pulled in, his tires spitting gravel, and the look he gave her. It wasn't anger, it was dismissal, like she was a piece of furniture in his way. I was watering my petunias, pretending not to watch, pretending it was just a normal, marital spat. I told myself it was none of my business. That lie has been a cold stone in my gut ever since. I saw her shoulders slump, her hand go to her stomach to shield her children from a wound I couldn't even see. He walked inside, without another word, leaving her alone among the roses. I just stood there, hose in hand, a coward. I could have asked if she was okay. I could have done anything, but I did nothing, and the silence began to poison the air between our houses. After the ambulance, the quiet was deafening. I watched from my kitchen window as her mother, Dorothy, arrived. Her face was granite, carved with a pain so deep it seemed impossible one person could hold it. I saw the nanny, the endless stream of casseroles from neighbors. I saw Grant greeting people at the door, accepting condolences with a practiced grief that never quite reached his eyes. And then I saw her, the woman from the cafe, the one with the bright red lipstick, signing the guest book at the funeral. My blood went cold. The pieces were there, scattered in my memory, and I was too afraid to put them together. I would see Dorothy in the yard, her gaze fixed on Colleen's garden, and the weight of what I hadn't said, of what I should have done, would press down on me until it was hard to breathe. Her daughter was gone, and I had just watered my flowers. One evening, I saw Dorothy's car pull out of the driveway long after the babies were asleep. There was a purpose in the way she drove, a straight-backed resolve that scared and inspired me. My mind kept replaying that day I'd seen Grant downtown, laughing with the redhead at a bistro. He was supposed to be at a conference. Colleen had told me so. Happy he was working so hard for their new family. I had waved at him. He hadn't seen me. My memory, a silent witness to so many small betrayals, was a constant, churning accusation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Colleen in her garden, alone, her husband's cruelty hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. I saw the red lipstick on the sympathy card left on the counter. The evidence was all there. In my head, useless and heavy. The whispers started a few weeks later. Custody, a fight. It all felt so ugly, so wrong. The note Colleen left, that's what people were saying. My inaction felt like a betrayal. I started writing things down, little things I remembered. The late-night phone calls he would take in his garage. The scent of a perfume that wasn't Colleen's, clinging to his jacket one day when he brought in our mail by mistake. The lie about the conference. It all felt so flimsy. The observations of a nosy neighbor. But then I remembered the date. I had taken a picture of a prize-winning rose in my garden that day, and in the background, across the street, you could just see him getting into his car. I checked the photo's timestamp. It was the same day Colleen posted a photo of her swollen feet, saying she was on bed rest and missed the sunshine. The photo was blurry, but it was him. It was his car, and it was 2 hours after he was supposed to have left for that conference. My hands shook as I zoomed in. He wasn't alone. A woman with fiery red hair was in the passenger seat. My stomach twisted. I remembered Colleen talking about how sick she was that week, how Grant was so supportive, bringing her crackers and ginger ale. He wasn't supportive. He was a liar. He was with her. While his wife was home, sick and carrying his 3 children, he was slipping away to be with someone else. All the small, disconnected moments clicked into place, forming a single, horrifying picture. My silence hadn't been respectful. It had been negligent. I had looked away when I should have been paying attention. I had chosen comfort over courage, and Colleen had paid the price. That was the part that broke me. Not just the affair, but the coldness of it. The meticulous planning. I thought about him asking her about life insurance, a detail I overheard someone mention at the grocery store. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a calculation. He wasn't just a cheating husband, he was a predator. And I had watched it happen. I had stood on my side of the fence and watched him circle his prey. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the photo on my phone, at the grainy image of his deception. It wasn't just a picture anymore. It was proof. It was a voice for a woman who no longer had one. I thought of those 3 babies, sleeping in their cribs, oblivious to the man who was supposed to protect them. They deserved the truth. Colleen deserved the truth. They deserved a fighter, like their grandmother. I saw Dorothy in the yard the next morning, pulling weeds from Colleen's garden with a ferocity that was breathtaking. She was the strongest person I knew, and she was fighting alone. I thought of Colleen's last words, the ones rumored to be in the letter. Fight for them. My own fight had been with my conscience, and I had been losing badly. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe my small, forgotten observation could become a weapon in Dorothy's hands. I looked at the picture on my phone one last time. It was a small truth in a sea of lies, but it was a truth nonetheless. I wouldn't let it stay hidden in my phone's gallery, another monument to my cowardice. I had to do something. I owed it to her. I owed it to those babies. I knew it was a long shot, that it might be nothing. But I printed the photo. I wrote down the date, the time, and every single detail I remembered from that day. The lie about the conference, Colleen's post online. My hands shook, not from fear anymore, but from a strange, unfamiliar resolve. It wasn't a confession. It was testimony. I folded the paper, put it in an envelope with the photograph, and walked across the lawn that separated our 2 houses, a distance that had felt like miles for months. His car was gone. I could see Dorothy through the kitchen window, sitting at the table, looking so tired. I didn't knock. I couldn't face her. Not yet. Instead, I slipped the envelope into her mailbox. It was a small act, a quiet one. But as I walked back to my own home, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the calm before a righteous storm. I didn't know the specifics, not then. I didn't know about the lawyer, Emmett, or the private investigator, or the damning text messages. I just knew that a change had happened. The heavy, suffocating silence had been broken by my one small act of courage. Telling Dorothy was like handing a weapon to a warrior. She had known something was wrong in her gut, but I had given her a place to start digging. I had carried Colleen's last words, her last desperate attempt to protect her family, and delivered them. It wasn't much, but it was everything. And as I watched from the sidelines, I prayed with all my heart that it would be enough to finally bring my friend justice. I remember the first time the dread settled in my stomach. It was a Tuesday. I was out watering my roses when I saw Colleen on her porch, her face ashen after a phone call. I could hear Grant inside, his laughter booming through the open window, and she just wilted. That image never left me. A couple of weeks after the funeral, I saw her mother, Dorothy, loading suitcases into her car. Her movements were heavy, deliberate. I just watched from behind my blinds, a coward as she drove away, and the guilt began to take root. The quiet on their side of the fence felt wrong. A house with 3 newborns should be bustling with a grandmother's love. Instead, a shiny new car pulled up. It was the woman from the funeral, the one whose hand lingered on Grant's arm for too long. I saw her move into the little guest house, the place Colleen used as her sanctuary, her office. She acted like she belonged there, and I told myself it was none of my business. It's just grief, I thought. But my heart knew better. I knew I was witnessing an invasion, and I let it happen. The erasure was methodical, almost cruel. New curtains appeared in the cottage windows overnight. A truck came and hauled away the family pictures from the hallway. Cold, sterile art took their place. From my kitchen, I saw Vivian pointing and directing the nanny. Her voice sharp, so unlike Colleen's. She was systematically wiping away every trace of the woman who had filled that home with light and laughter. Each change was a stab of guilt in my conscience, a reminder of my silence, my complicity. It felt like I was watching a memory being murdered. My friend Joan showed me the picture on her phone, her face grim. It was Vivian's social media account, and there they were, a pair of tiny, perfect baby shoes with hand-stitched daisies. My breath caught in my throat. I'd seen those shoes. Colleen had shown them to me over the fence, her eyes sparkling with joy. The caption underneath read something like, "A second chance at building a family." My stomach turned. This wasn't a second chance. It was a hostile takeover, built on the wreckage of my friend's life. The regret was so thick, I could barely breathe. I didn't know the ugly details about the money, not then, but you could see it. A new $75,000 car in the driveway. Vivian returning from shopping trips with bags from high-end boutiques. It happened so fast, it was dizzying. I put 2 and 2 together. Colleen's life had paid for all this. Every time I saw Grant and Vivian laughing in the yard, all I could think about was how my neighbor had been reduced to a dollar amount, a forged signature funding their happily ever after. The injustice of it all kept me up at night. Then one morning, I saw Dorothy pulling into the pediatrician's parking lot. She looked exhausted, worn down to the bone, but her jaw was set, with a resolve that was almost frightening. She was wrestling that huge triple stroller that Colleen had been so excited to order. She wasn't just a grieving grandmother. She was a soldier heading into battle. A while later, I saw Vivian's car tear out of the lot, way too fast. When Dorothy emerged with her 3 grandbabies, walking tall and steady, I felt the first real flicker of hope. I watched Vivian get home, her face a mask of fury as she slammed her car door. But Dorothy didn't go back to her hotel. I saw her car turn toward the cemetery. From my upstairs window, I could just make out her small frame walking to Colleen's grave. She just sat there on the grass, a lonely guardian. Seeing her so small and so strong, sitting there all alone, something inside me finally snapped. I couldn't be a spectator anymore. I couldn't hide behind my curtains while that woman fought for her daughter all by herself. She sat beside the granite headstone until the sun started to set. I imagined her talking to Colleen, making promises. I thought of all the times Colleen had looked tired, and I'd said nothing. All the times I'd heard them arguing and just turned up my television. My silence had been a choice, and it was the wrong one. With my heart pounding, I found the phone number for Dorothy's attorney. My voice shook when he answered, but I pushed the words out. I told him I was Colleen's neighbor. I told him I needed to tell him what I saw. I remember the day the color started to drain from her world. It was a Tuesday, I think. We were supposed to go to that little cafe she loved, but she canceled. Another excuse. It was the beginning of the end of our Tuesdays, and I just let it happen. I let her fade. Now I sit here, clutching my phone, waiting for news, thinking about the vibrant sunset she painted in the nursery. I imagine her fighting a quiet war I never even knew was happening, building a case while she built a home for her babies. That night, I just went about my evening, oblivious. I didn't call again. I didn't push. I just let her go. And now a man I once called a friend, a man named Whitfield Bradford, Whitfield III, is trying to erase her completely. A name that reeks of entitlement, a name that's never known what it is to truly fear. I heard about the restraining order through the town grapevine, a sickening whisper over coffee. They called Dorothy unstable, irrational. They twisted a mother's grief into a weapon against her. And Laurel Ashford, with her perfect pearls and even more perfect lies, signed her name to it. I saw Laurel at a charity event once, her eyes scanning the room, appraising everything. Now I know what she was doing, calculating, judging, dismissing anything that didn't fit her perfect picture. Reading her sworn statement felt like a physical blow to call Dorothy's pain a scene that embarrassed the family. It was monstrous. It was a tactic, plain and simple. Isolate the one person who knew the truth, paint her as crazy, and seize control. I felt my own silence choke me. My inaction had helped build their stage. When the call came from Dorothy's lawyer, Emmett, my heart hammered against my ribs. He asked if I'd be willing to give a statement, to speak for Colleen. It was a lifeline, a chance to undo some small part of my silence. He told me they were fighting for a guardian ad litem, an advocate just for the triplets. He explained the grounds. The other woman, Vivian, moved in almost immediately, her friend hired as the nanny. The world had kept spinning, its ordinary sounds a constant hum in the background while Colleen's life had been systematically dismantled. My own small world had spun on too, but not anymore. Yes, I said, my voice shaking but clear. I'll do it. Then he mentioned a DNA test. A standard procedure, he said. But I heard it too, that tremor in his voice. A feeling just below the surface, a hint of something deeper and uglier. I asked him why. Because, he said, his voice low and grim, men who lie about money also lie about other things. The words hung in the air long after we hung up. The 21 days until the hearing felt like a lifetime. I spent them going over every memory, every conversation. I met with Emmett, my hands trembling as I recounted what I knew. He told me about the forensic accountant, Patricia, who had uncovered Grant's paper castle built on a foundation of fraud. The hidden company, the condo, the stolen inheritance. It all clicked into place. And then it was my turn to talk, to add my own small, brittle bricks, to the case. I told him about the last phone call, the one where Colleen's voice sounded so small. I told him about the baby shoes she posted online. I told him how my friend had changed over 3 years, how she went from sunshine to shadow, how her laughter was replaced by apologies. She was always tired, I told Emmett, the words catching in my throat, always making excuses for Grant. I confessed my own failure then, the guilt a raw, open wound. I didn't push. I should have asked. I'll live with that for the rest of my life. My testimony felt like too little too late, but it was all I had left to give her. I saw her brother, Fletch, at the lawyer's office. He had a toolbox in his car and a storm in his eyes. He wasn't going to be silent. He was there to see it through. The days leading up to the hearing were thick with dread. I'd walk my dog, not really seeing the path, just moving, one foot in front of the other, trying to outwalk the ghosts. I didn't have her journal, but I had my own version of it, a catalog of memories stored in my head. A book club meeting she missed. A lunch date she canceled. The time I heard Grant in the background, his voice sharp, and how she'd quickly hung up. I could picture her writing in that lavender notebook, documenting her own heartbreak. Week 8. She would have told me about the 3 heartbeats, her voice filled with awe. Week 12, she'd have complained about the nausea, but laughed through it. Week 16, we would have debated names for hours over tea, but I wasn't there. I had let the distance grow, fooled by Grant's perfect image and her quiet reassurances that everything was fine. Now I saw what fine really meant. I remembered her asking me once, "Avez-vous?" out of the blue, if I thought gold hoops were her style. I'd said, "Of course," not realizing it wasn't a fashion question. It was a piece of a puzzle, an earring found in his car. I remembered her mentioning a new, cloying perfume that lingered on his clothes, a scent that wasn't hers. Each memory was a clue I had completely missed. She had hired an investigator. She had fought back, all on her own. Her name was Vivian Holloway, 29, with my husband for at least 2 years. The facts were brutal, clinical. I imagined Colleen reading that report, her world collapsing in silence, while I was probably complaining about some trivial, everyday annoyance. She was preparing a nursery and an escape plan at the same time, choosing paint colors with one hand and gathering evidence with the other. A warrior in a war no one knew she was fighting, because her enemy had convinced her she was crazy for even thinking there was a battle. My silence had been her prison's 4th wall. I sat in my quiet living room, the book we were supposed to discuss sitting unread on the table. The 3 documents on Dorothy's hotel nightstand were her history. My memories, my guilt, that was part of Colleen's history too, the part that was never written down. I thought of the woman she used to be, the one who sang off-key in the car and made friends with strangers, the woman Grant had erased so methodically, the one I had failed to save. I closed my eyes, a silent apology whispered into the dark. "I'm so sorry, Collie. I should have been there." The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. The next morning, I got dressed, not in my usual bright colors, but in a simple, dark blue dress. I drove to the courthouse. I didn't have to be there, but I had to be. I saw Dorothy, a pillar of strength in navy blue, holding a leather purse that I knew held her daughter's last words. My courageous act was giving the deposition, but being there today, that was my promise. I watched Grant arrive with his lawyer, all tailored suits and false confidence. I stood in the hall, a silent witness no longer, ready to see this through. When I walked into that courtroom, my knees were trembling. Grant sat there, looking perfectly composed while his expensive lawyer described Dorothy as an overbearing and controlling presence. The word felt like a slap. I remembered Colleen telling me, "I don't know what I'd do without my mom." That was the truth I held. It was a small thing, my testimony, just a few sentences from the lady next door. But as I walked to the witness stand, I caught Dorothy's eye, and in that look, I finally found a sliver of redemption. I was done being silent. It began the day I saw her car pull up, the sleek, unfamiliar one. She got out like she owned the place, while the memorial wreath for Colleen was still on the front door. I told myself it was none of my business. Then I saw Dorothy arrive, her face a mask of grief, and heard Grant's voice, smooth and cruel, telling her to leave. Every excuse he made was a carefully polished lie, a distortion of a truth I was witnessing from my kitchen window. I watched him twist her concern into obsession, her love into interference. I stood there silent, letting the lies hang in the air between our houses. I saw the papers he eventually served her with, and knew his version of events wasn't just incomplete. It was a deliberate demolition of a grieving grandmother. I saw moving vans, her daughter's life being packed away while a new one moved in. It was all there, the stolen inheritance happening right before my eyes. I saw it all happen from behind my curtains, the quiet fury building until it couldn't be contained. The threads of that family pulled so tight they were bound to snap. I remember watching Dorothy, just trying to get a response from Grant, just trying to understand. She stood on his perfect lawn, her shoulders slumped, looking up at the window that used to be her daughter's. I couldn't hear her words, but I could feel them. Her voice must have been cracking with pain as she tried to plead with him. She was a mother whose whole world had been stolen. 3 grandbabies she couldn't hold, a lullaby she couldn't sing, all while the man who should have been grieving with her was replacing every memory of his wife. He was erasing her from the walls, from the rooms, from her own life story. And I just watched, a ghost in the house next door. Her resolve was palpable, even from a distance. I saw it in the way she held her head high every time she drove away, probably heading to another meeting with her lawyer. She wasn't just a meddling mother-in-law. She was a woman keeping a promise. I knew somehow that Colleen had left her something, a reason to fight this hard. I'd see Grant leaving, looking untouchable, and I'd feel sick. The court granted her visits, supervised, a small victory that felt monumental. I saw Grant's jaw clench from across the street the day he had to hand a baby carrier over. Later, I saw her son Fletch pacing on the sidewalk, a storm contained in a human body waiting. I saw the moment he confronted Grant, not with a shout, but with a voice so low and chilling, it cut through the evening air. "You didn't have to use your hands," I heard him say. "You just destroyed her spirit until her body gave up. You took everything from her." And I watched Grant's reaction, the way he just stood there, adjusting his perfectly starched collar, a man completely insulated from the chaos he'd caused. He spoke of Colleen's sickness, his words dripping with false gentleness, twisting her pain into a weapon he could use. He made himself the hero of a tragedy, he wrote. Fletch's hands were shaking, but Dorothy's grip on his arm was like iron. It was a silent plea to wait, to hold on, that our time would come. And Fletch looked at Grant and said something I'll never forget. "Colleen knew. She knew exactly what you were, and she made sure we all would, too." Grant drove away, but he didn't go far. He just sat in his car at the end of the street, the engine off, for what felt like hours. I saw the light on in her hotel room across the street, late into the night. I imagined her in there, alone, the weight of it all finally crashing down on her. I pictured her sliding to the floor, holding on to some letter, some piece of Colleen she had left, whispering to her daughter that she was 61 years old and scared she wasn't strong enough. I knew that feeling of being outmatched by money and power and shameless lies. From my window, I saw her reflection, a solitary figure in a brightly lit, impersonal room. I saw her see herself, and in that moment, I think she saw her daughter looking back, saw the same fire in her eyes. I watched her push herself up from the floor. She stood tall, splashed water on her face, and then she picked up the phone. My own hands felt heavy, useless. She was just trying to feel connected to something, to anyone. I knew she didn't need the extra towels she was asking for. She just needed to break the awful quiet that sounds so much like loss. The clerk on the phone was probably some kid, cheerful and oblivious, promising to send them right up. After she hung up, her light stayed on. I saw her shadow as she sat at the little desk, writing, documenting every lie, every injustice. A little while later, she got in her car and drove off. It was almost 2 in the morning. I wondered where a woman, consumed by grief, goes at that hour. I felt a pang of shame, sitting in my warm house, while she was out there, all alone in the fight, searching for a cup of coffee and a moment's peace. She found a 24-hour diner. I know because I saw her come back as the sun was rising. Her car window down, in the biting cold, she was letting the chill wake her up, a reminder that she was still breathing, still in the fight. 6 weeks crawled by like that. The DNA results were coming. I'd see her during the supervised visits, her car full of tiny outfits for the triplets. She would walk to the door, her face a mixture of hope and heartbreak, and then leave an hour later, looking completely drained. The patience she was supposed to have was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then the call must have come. It was a Tuesday. She was folding those tiny baby clothes by her hotel window when I saw her freeze, phone to her ear. I held my own breath from across the street, praying for her. I remember the day Colleen brought them home. 3 perfect bundles. Her whole world was right there in her arms. But I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, a kind of loneliness that didn't make sense. Now, hearing the news, it all clicks into place. My phone buzzes with a neighborhood alert, a link to a story that feels like an earthquake. The triplets, it says. DNA results. I remember seeing Grant that first week, all smiles for the cameras, but never helping with the night feeding. I stood at my window and watched, and I told myself it wasn't my business. The report says none of them are his. Not 1, not 2, all 3. The world under my feet feels unsteady, just like I imagine it must have for Dorothy, Colleen's mom. I touch my own wall, solid and real, a luxury Colleen didn't have. She was living in a house that was built on a lie, and I was next door, watering my plants, pretending not to notice the cracks forming in her foundation. How could it happen? The question hangs in the air of every coffee shop in town. They say it was IVF, that his samples weren't viable. I remember seeing her car leaving for early morning appointments, always alone. He'd be jogging when she got back, waving like the perfect husband. The clinic suggested a donor. A standard procedure, they say, but only she signed the form. Only she knew. Grant wasn't told. I picture her sitting in that sterile office, making a choice that would define the rest of her life, completely by herself. She knew, of course she knew. The thought is a punch to the gut. The clinic told her his samples wouldn't work, and she moved forward anyway, protecting a dream he was too proud to help build. I saw her strength every day, but I mistook it for simple resilience. It wasn't. It was a quiet, desperate act of creation. Why didn't she tell him? That's what everyone is asking. Then her lawyer released a page from her journal. Reading her words feels like an invasion, but it's also a relief. She wrote that he would have refused, that his pride mattered more than their family. She wanted those babies more than his permission. For once, she made a choice that was just for her. The words land hard. I remember seeing them in the yard one day. He was criticizing the way she planted the roses, and she just had this look on her face. Not angry, just tired. Utterly tired. She wasn't having an affair. She was making a medical decision because the man she loved was too fragile to face the truth. And now that same man is crying on TV, fighting for children who aren't his, for money that isn't his, trying to ruin the name of a woman who built her entire world while he wasn't looking. What happens now? I asked my husband last night. He just shook his head. The news says Grant's case for custody is falling apart. No biological tie, a history of cheating, and money fraud. It's not a good look. And then there's Vivian, the other woman. When she first heard the DNA results, she thought she'd won. She told everyone Colleen was the liar, the cheater. For 48 hours, she was the victim. I saw her at the grocery store, smug and triumphant. She was telling the story to anyone who would listen, spinning a tale of her poor, deceived Grant. Then the clinic records came out, the donor form with Colleen's signature, the medical proof. The whole story wasn't an affair. It was a choice made in a doctor's office. The world turned on him overnight. It was brutal. Colleen wasn't a traitor. She was a warrior. She'd carried 3 babies, managed a high-risk pregnancy, and decorated their nursery, all while knowing her husband was with someone else. I remember seeing the lights on in the nursery at all hours. I thought she was just a nervous new mom. But she was doing it all. Grant wasn't heartbroken. He was humiliated. His legacy, his name, it was all a fantasy. His own mother, Laurel, cut him off. I overheard a neighbor say Laurel told him the children were someone else's problem now. The irony is sickening. He spent years cheating on the one person who was actually building the family he claimed to want. He lied and he stole while she endured the needles and the appointments and the emotional roller coaster all by herself. A doctor came forward, Nina Prescott. She told Colleen's mother that a week before the triplets were born, Colleen made her promise something. If anything goes wrong, she'd said, make sure my mother gets the babies, not Grant. My mother. I remember talking to Colleen over the fence just after she'd announced her pregnancy. She looked so happy, but there was something in her eyes, a shadow of worry. She told me, I just want to make sure they'll always be safe, no matter what. I thought it was just normal motherly anxiety. I told her not to worry, that everything would be perfect. But now I know she wasn't just worried. She was planning. She was protecting her children from a future she could already see coming. She was making sure her mother would be there to stand in the gap she knew her husband would leave. Then Grant went on Channel 7, trying to salvage his image. He sat in that living room, the one I'd seen Colleen painstakingly decorate, with all her pictures gone. He wore a simple shirt, no tie, trying to look like an honest, wounded man. I loved my wife, he said, his eyes perfectly misty. I thought those children were mine. He played the part so well. He even admitted he'd made mistakes. A gentle word for the affair that tore his family apart. He claimed his fatherhood was stolen from him. I watched, and my blood ran cold. I saw him with Vivian. I saw them laughing in his car down the street a month before Colleen died. He wasn't a man who had made mistakes. He was a man who had made a choice, over and over again. The interview went viral, but not the way he'd hoped. At first, people felt sorry for him. But the internet asks questions. Why did his girlfriend move in 2 weeks after the funeral? Why was he filing for life insurance before the grief set in? Then, 3 days later, Colleen's lawyer released the proof. The forged signature. The hundreds of thousands of dollars moved to a shell company that bought Vivian a condo. The timeline showing the affair started long before the IVF. Everything I'd suspected, everything I'd seen in stolen glances and overheard arguments was now laid bare for the world to see. I had seen Vivian's car there, late at night. I had seen the packages addressed to her arriving at their house. I saw it all. and I stayed silent. And then came the text message. Grant to Vivian, 4 months before Colleen's death. Once the babies are born, we will be free. She will sign whatever I put in front of her. That was it. Public opinion didn't just shift, it shattered. Every woman who had ever been gaslit, cheated on, or called crazy saw herself in Colleen. She became a hero, the woman who built a legal fortress around her children from her own nursery, the woman who fought a silent war and won. And as I read the comments, the outrage, the support for Colleen, the shame I'd been carrying turned into resolve. I remembered something. A date. The day I saw Grant and Vivian leaving a hotel downtown. The same day he was supposed to be at a conference. I even have a photo on my phone. A stupid picture of a bird on a sign, with them in the background. My hands shake as I dial the number for Emmett's law office. My voice is small, but it's there. Hello, I say. My name is Sarah. I was Colleen's neighbor. I think I have something you need to see. I remember it was a Thursday night. His phone must have rung, a number he didn't know. It was Vivian. I know because the next morning, I saw her walking toward a downtown office building, looking like a ghost. Her face was bare, her hair pulled back, her eyes red and puffy. The performance was over. She was the woman who had finally seen the truth. She must have told him everything, about the other woman, Danielle, the texts on bed that started just 2 weeks after Colleen was gone. While Vivian was naively setting up a nursery, believing she was the one, history was repeating itself. She found the messages, just like Colleen had, only this time, she wasn't going to be silent. I saw her leave that office hours later, her shoulders a little less slumped, as if a great weight had been lifted. She must have told him how Grant needed a woman, any woman, to look good for the court, because the world doesn't trust a single father. She must have admitted that Colleen was just a prop to him, a part of the perfect image he was selling. I can almost hear her voice, cracked and raw, admitting that she's not the good person in this story. She knew he was married, but she told herself the lies that people tell themselves to sleep at night, that she was different, that she was saving him. But she never knew about the stolen insurance. That night, watching her walk away from that building, I finally understood. The guilt I had carried for months, for staying silent, became unbearable. My hands shook as I looked up the number for Emmett Calloway's office. I took a deep breath, and I made the call. I told the woman who answered that I was Colleen's neighbor, that I saw when Vivian Holloway really moved in, and that I was so sorry I hadn't spoken up sooner. I remember the first time I saw his other car, the one that wasn't hers, parked just down the street. I told myself it was nothing. I saw her through the kitchen window, pregnant and exhausted, and I just waved. I should have done more than wave. I should have known. When she passed, I watched him from my window, a performance of grief. Then her mother, Dorothy, arrived. I saw her wrestle that huge new stroller out of the box. I saw the look on her face. When she saw her daughter's name on the shipping tag, I thought my heart would break for her, for all of them. I was wrong to have stayed silent. I watched her leave the house with them, pushing that stroller Colleen would never touch. The price tag still dangled from the handle, a tiny, brutal reminder. I imagined Dorothy walking past the playground where I'd once seen Colleen sitting, dreaming. She was gone for hours that day. I kept looking out my window, worried. She walked through that park, carrying the weight of a fight she shouldn't have had to wage. She never looked at her phone. She just kept going, one foot in front of the other. When she returned, her face was set like stone. The trial was the next day. I knew it. The whole street knew it. The morning of the last hearing, the air itself felt heavy, buzzing with what was to come. I saw Dorothy leave, wearing a simple navy dress like armor. She carried a brown purse, clutching it like a shield. I recognized it from the few times I'd spoken with Colleen in the yard. Grant left later, all alone. The swagger was gone. His expensive lawyer was gone. I'd read the news online, of course. The headlines were awful, splashing their family's name next to words like fraud and deception. It was all methodical. The report said, just how Colleen would have planned it. A perfect, airtight case, built from beyond the grave. I read the updates on my phone, hiding in my own kitchen. The DNA results that weren't his. The clinic forms signed only by her. Her own journal, explaining why she'd done it by herself. Then came the testimony from the other woman. I saw her picture in the articles. The affair, the texts, the recordings of his plotting. He didn't love any of them, she'd said. They were just props in the perfect story he was writing for himself. And when the main character defied him, he tried to erase her and write her out. I felt sick. He had waved to me, too. I was another character in his story of the perfect neighborhood. I even read about Jolene, her best friend, who spoke of the laughter that vanished from Colleen's voice. I wished I had been that kind of friend, someone who fought harder. The Guardian's report was damning, recommending Dorothy without hesitation. The news sites went silent then, waiting for the verdict. I spent 2 hours refreshing the county court page. I watched their empty driveway, my stomach in knots. I saw his car pull in first, then hers. I paced my own hallway, a metronome of anxiety, just praying for those babies. For the woman who had already been through enough. 34 minutes after I saw our car return, my phone buzzed with the news alert. Full legal and physical custody awarded to Dorothy Ann Brennan. I leaned against the counter and just breathed. I couldn't imagine the silence in her house, the weight of those words finally landing. The court ordered him to repay everything. His medical license was under review. He was ruined, a hollowed-out man who had run out of moves. I saw a flicker of movement through her curtains, just a shadow, and I hoped for the first time in a long time that it was peace. The judge's final words, as reported online, were for Colleen. A remarkable record, she called it, not just of evidence, but of love. The court was honored to fulfill her wishes. I started to cry then. For the daughter who had to build a fortress to protect her children from their own father. Later, I saw the lawyer's car pull up. He handed Dorothy a small white envelope before he left. She didn't open it. She just held it. She got in her own car and drove away, and I knew she wasn't going to the store. Some things you can't face until the war is truly over. I didn't see her come back for hours. I knew where she'd gone. The cemetery, to the place where Colleen was. I thought about the daffodils Colleen had planted along our shared fence line. She told me she loved them because they were proof that beautiful things could survive the cold. It was all I could think about, while the online news comments filled with poison and speculation. 2 things happened, the lawyer had said. The babies are safe, and you fought for them. Colleen had known her mother would. She'd known. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ugly comments online, the story Grant had tried to sell the world, it was all churning in my gut. My silence felt like a betrayal. So I did the only thing I could. I found the worst article, the one twisting the facts, and I scrolled to the comments. I took a deep breath. I was her neighbor, I wrote. She told me once that she loved daffodils because they were proof that things could survive the cold. She was getting ready for her babies. She was kind. It wasn't much. It was just a small, true thing. But it was my turn to fight for her, to tell them I saw her too. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of peace. I remember the first time I saw the light go out in Colleen's eyes. It was a Tuesday, over the fence separating our yards. He'd said something sharp, and her smile just crumbled. I turned away, pretending to deadhead my roses. Now, from that same window, I see her mother's car. I see Fletch in the passenger seat, Jolene in the back. I see the tops of 3 tiny car seats, a new nanny helping. Her mother, Dorothy, gets in, her face a mask of grief then. In her rearview mirror, I see it, a flicker, not happiness, not yet, but something real, something that survived him. And the guilt is a stone in my gut. 6 months, and the house next door is breathing again. It isn't the kind of change you notice day to day, but one morning, you just see it. I saw the light in their bedroom window change from a cold gray to a warm, soft yellow. Colleen loved yellow. She told me once it was the color of a good morning. From my kitchen, I see the photos go back up on the walls, a constellation of her smiling face. Then new ones appear, crowding in. The triplets, month by month, a defiant timeline of life going on. I watched that house go dark, and I never once knocked on the door. I saw her garden wither after she was gone. Now, I watch Dorothy out there every evening with a watering can and a book. It's Colleen's gardening journal. I recognize the cover. Slowly, life is returning to the soil. The rosemary made it through the winter, a stubborn little victory. I read about Grant in the paper. Probation, a fine. He got to walk away. His practice closed, the hospital cut him loose. A disgrace, they called it. I call it a beginning. I could have said something sooner. I heard things. I saw things. But I didn't. His mother, Laurel, only cared about the family name. I saw her car there just once after, a sleek black sedan that looked like it was holding its breath. She was all sharp angles and disapproval, embarrassed by the mess. Then there was Vivian. I saw her too, coming and going at all hours. I watched a moving truck empty that condo he bought her, all that money that should have been for Colleen. She vanished, left a stain on all our lives, and just disappeared. My silence feels like a stain too, a permanent one. Then the visitors started coming, the ones who were building a fortress of kindness around that family. A doctor, Nina Prescott, every couple of weeks. Not just for checkups. I'd see her sitting at the kitchen table, just talking with Dorothy for hours. They looked like old friends. And Jolene, every Sunday morning, like clockwork. She'd show up with a bag from the Highland Avenue bakery. I knew it was the same one she and Colleen used to go to. Every week, a little ritual of remembrance. A ritual I was never a part of. Her brother, Fletch, started building a treehouse. For 3 weekends, my Saturdays were filled with the sound of his saw and hammer. He was building something for the future, for children who couldn't even sit up yet. He was building a space for them to be closer to the sky, closer to her. I watched him from my porch, this quiet, determined man, building a monument out of cedar planks and love. He put a little sign on the door. From my yard, I could just make out the words carved into the wood. A house for his collie. I heard a laugh from the backyard that Sunday. It was Dorothy. I hadn't heard that sound in over a year. It was real, rising up from her belly and catching on the afternoon air. It was the sound of a window opening in a house that had been sealed shut for too long. Later, after the sun went down, the nursery light came on, a soft yellow glow from 3 small stars on the wall. I'd see her in there sometimes, a shadow in the rocking chair, a silent guardian between the 3 cribs. She was keeping watch. Tonight, the creak of her rocking chair seems to travel across the lawn. The rhythm is steady. A heartbeat in the quiet house. I see the 3 star-shaped night lights making constellations on the ceiling. I think of the children sleeping in their cribs, each one a piece of Colleen that the world couldn't take. And I know my silence has a cost. So I sit at my own kitchen table, the one that looks right into their yard. I pull out a pen and a clean sheet of paper. My hands shake, but I begin to write. A letter to the state medical board, an anonymous account of an argument I overheard about a signature forged on an insurance document. It's a small thing, a quiet thing, but it's a start. I remember the day she told me, her face alight with impossible news. Triplets. But I also saw him, standing behind her, the shadow in her sunshine. I watched from my window as she grew, preparing a fortress for 3 souls he never wanted. I heard the hushed arguments, saw the cars that weren't his pull away late at night. I told myself it wasn't my business, that she was strong. But my silence was a kind of betrayal. The truth is, I saw a woman fighting a war alone, building a future for her children before the world even knew she was dying. And all I did was watch, waiting for someone braver than me to step in, to say something, to help. Now her mother is in that house. I see the nursery light glowing, a soft yellow beacon in the dark. From my own window, I watch her silhouette, a steady, unmoving guardian. The yard is the same, the old oak tree still stands, but the air feels different. It's quiet, but it's a peaceful quiet, not the tense silence that suffocated that home before. I think about all the times I could have crossed that lawn, knocked on that door, offered a cup of coffee, an ear. I never did. And now, seeing that grandmother stand vigil, my regret feels sharp, a physical ache in my chest. Her devotion is a mirror to my own cowardice. I stayed on my side of the fence, and I will never forgive myself for it. Tonight, the faint sound of a melody drifts across the lawn. The lullaby, the one I heard Colleen hum to her belly on the porch swing so many afternoons. It's a sound that connects them all. A thread of love that death couldn't snap. Hearing it now, sung by her mother, breaks something open inside me. I remember an argument I overheard, words I pushed away because they were too ugly. He told her they weren't his. He said it with such casual cruelty. At the time, I closed my window, but now, that memory is a burning coal in my mind. I can't pretend I didn't hear it anymore. That quiet song is a call to action I have ignored for far too long. I can't change the past, but I can honor her memory. So I do the one small thing I should have done months ago. I write a letter. My hand shakes as I detail the date, the time, the exact words I heard him say. I sign it simply, a neighbor who should have spoken up sooner. I mail it to her mother's lawyer. It's a small, anonymous act, a whisper of truth in a storm of lies. But it's my testimony. It's proof that a mother's love creates ripples, that it inspires courage in others even after she's gone. It's my way of finally telling her, I see you, I hear you. Your fight was not in vain, and for the first time in a long time, there's a flicker of hope inside me. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.